I must say I've been puzzled by the completely contradictory information that's been sort of popping out of Washington and Moscow. It began as a grand gesture, another deal of the century moment for Donald Trump, having brokered the shaky truce in Gaza, which Vance says is perfectly okay now. He seemed intent on extending his self-styled aura of peacemaker to Europe's blood-stained plains. The plan was to meet Vladimir Putin in Budapest, a city chosen, one suspects, as much for Viktor Orban's sycophantic hospitality as for any diplomatic merit. But then, within hours of Bulgaria confirming today that Putin could cross its airspace to attend, the entire scheme seems to have collapsed. The second Trump-Putin summit was aborted almost as soon as it was conceived. The reason officially is banal. The White House blandly declared that there were no plans for a meeting in the immediate future. Unofficially, it was the inevitable consequence of a fantasy colliding with the hard granite of Russian intransigence. Sergei Lavrov and Marco Rubio's preparatory phone call had turned poisonous. Rubio pressed for a ceasefire along the existing front line, a pragmatic proposal backed by Britain, France, Germany and Ukraine itself. Lavrov responded with the same doctrinaire rigidity that has defined Russian diplomacy since 2014, no ceasefire, no compromise, and no recognition of the current front lines. For Moscow, peace can only exist when Kyiv has capitulated and the Donbass, all of it, is in Russian hands. Trump had earlier parroted Putin's talking points after a 2-hour call suggesting Ukraine might cut and stop at the battle line. Yet at the weekend, even as he seemed to recognize that Putin was offering nothing new, the Russian position hadn't shifted an inch since their first meeting in Alaska. In truth, Trump's planned Budapest summit was less about peace and more about theatre, a stage upon which he could replay his familiar role as the deal-maker, surrounded by deferential aides and adoring cameras. The irony, of course, is that the only progress came from Ukraine. President Zelensky, faced with pressure from Washington and fatigue in Europe, held firm. He stated publicly that the front line can be the beginning of diplomacy, but only the beginning. His refusal to surrender Donetsk, the symbolic and strategic heart of eastern Ukraine, effectively torpedoes Trump's hope of declaring an easy victory, and for once the White House fell into line behind Kyiv. The coalition of the willing, chaired by Britain and France, issued a joint declaration insisting that any negotiation must begin from the current line of contact and uphold the principle that international borders must not be changed by force. Meanwhile, Russia bristled. Lavrov accused Europe of seeking a ceasefire merely to rearm Ukraine. Dmitry Peskov muttered that there could be no postponement of what was never finalized, and Putin, who had already tested the limits of European patience by requesting overflight permission from Bulgaria, now found himself with nowhere to go, literally and diplomatically. Back to the fridge! The sequence of events lays bare 3 truths. First, Trump's foreign policy remains transactional to the point of incoherence. He vacillates between admiration for strongmen and a populist urge to stop the killing. He praises Putin one day and parrots Zelensky the next. The Europeans have learned to manage him through flattery. Mark Rutte, the NATO, apparently I pronounced his name wrongly, I'm so sorry. The NATO Secretary General has become adept at it, but management is not leadership. Second, Putin's strategy is frozen in his own rhetoric. He still speaks of root causes, NATO expansion, Russian speakers' denazification, the well-worn lexicon of grievance that has justified every atrocity since 2022, his so-called constitutional claim to Ukrainian regions annexed by sham referenda, has boxed him into an ideological corner from which diplomacy is impossible. The Budapest meeting, had it occurred, would have been an exercise in futility, a tyrant pretending to negotiate and a showman pretending to understand him. Third, the unity of Ukraine's allies is holding just. The London meeting of 30 nations later this week will focus on a 12-point plan moulded on the Gaza Accord, return of abducted children, a pathway to EU membership, reconstruction, security guarantees under a multinational stabilization force. This is the most comprehensive attempt yet to outline a post-war order for Ukraine. It also signals Europe's determination not to let Trump dictate peace on his own terms. The timing of the aborted summit could not be more symbolic. Bulgaria's decision to permit Putin's passage exposed the lingering divisions within NATO's eastern flank. Yet within minutes, the meeting itself had dissolved. The optics are striking. A dictator cleared for takeoff, a populist poised for his next photo op, and both grounded by the weight of their own contradictions. In the end, Trump's Budapest fantasy was undone not by diplomacy but by definition. To negotiate requires mutual recognition of limits. Russia has none. Ukraine has drawn its line in blood. And Trump, though briefly tempted by the illusion of grandeur, has discovered that peace cannot be conjured by instinct or ego alone. The great tragedy is that while the world debates the choreography of cancelled summits, Ukrainians continue to die, defending what remains of their homeland. But there's also a quiet triumph in this episode. The West for once didn't blink. Trump's erratic overtures were checked, Putin's delusions exposed, and Zelensky's moral clarity prevailed. Budapest will now join a long list of unrealized peace conferences from Munich to Reykjavik, remembered less for what was achieved than for what was avoided, and perhaps that is its true legacy, a meeting that never happened because at last someone in Washington understood that talking to Putin on Putin's terms is not diplomacy, it is surrender disguised as conversation, it is capitulation to an lollipop.